The pool was exactly as I remembered it. That particular shade of blue that only exists in the south of France when the light comes in from the east in the morning and the water has been still all night and there is nobody in it yet. Ceramic tiles from a workshop in Marseille that I had spent 3 days selecting in 2009 with a tile man named Gerard, who had opinions about depth of color that I did not fully understand at the time, and which turned out to be completely correct. A row of cypress trees along the south wall that I had planted as saplings, and which were now tall enough to throw real shade by mid-morning, which was what I had wanted and had been told would take 15 years and had taken 12. I was sitting in the chair on the left side of the pool terrace, the one with a direct view of the valley, with a cup of coffee and the particular quiet of a property that has been closed for several months and is waking up again. And the manager of the property, a Frenchman named Etienne Moreau, who had been looking after the villa for 9 years, was standing at the gate when the car came through on Friday afternoon. The car stopped. The doors opened. 6 people got out. My daughter-in-law was the first one through the gate. Etienne said, "Madame Laurent." And then he turned and gestured toward the terrace. And then he said, "Monsieur Holt is already in residence. He arrived Wednesday." She looked at the terrace. I raised my coffee cup. She did not speak for 4 hours. Let me tell you why. My name is Peter Holt. I am 59 years old. I spent 31 years building a property development company based in London that operated across the UK, France, Portugal, and in the later years, the western coast of Italy. Not the largest firm in the sector, not the kind of operation that makes newspapers unless something goes wrong, which in 31 years happened twice and was handled without lasting damage both times. A solid, serious firm that built and managed properties with the kind of attention that comes when the person at the top understands what things should feel like when they are done correctly, because he has spent a great deal of his own life understanding what incorrectly feels like. I grew up in Sheffield. My father worked in a foundry for 28 years. My mother cleaned offices in the city center for 18 years before her knees gave out, and she moved to the school canteen. We lived in a terrace house on a street where every other house was identical, which I found oppressive at 14 and have found strangely grounding ever since. The house had a small back garden that my mother kept with a seriousness that I did not understand until I was much older and understood that the garden was the only thing in her life that responded exactly as much as she put in, and no more. I left Sheffield at 18 for a construction management course in Leeds, worked summers on building sites from the first year, learned the physical logic of structures before I learned the financial logic, which I believe is the right order, and which I have never been able to fully explain to people who learned it the other way. I spent 5 years with a large development firm in Manchester after graduating, then 4 with a smaller specialist firm in London, then started my own operation in Tisica Davidsot Devonostov with a business partner named Graham Fletcher, and a project in the Bristol Harbourside development that we won against 3 larger competitors and delivered on time and under budget, which is the kind of beginning that people refer to later as lucky. And that was actually the product of bidding correctly and sleeping very little. I bought the villa in Provence in 2009. It is not a large villa by the standards of Provence, where scale is measured differently than in England, and where a property of 11 rooms can be considered modest by neighbors who have 30. It has a main house, a guest cottage, a pool with Gerard's tiles, 12 acres of land with lavender and olive trees and the cypress saplings that are now proper trees, and a view of the Luberon Valley that on clear mornings makes everything that happened the day before feel appropriately small. I bought it because my wife Catherine had loved Provence since a holiday we took there in 1994, when we were still renting a flat in Battersea and could not afford the kind of holiday we wanted, and went anyway and spent the whole week pretending we could afford it, which turned out to be most of the fun. She said on the last day of that trip, sitting in a cafe in Apt with a glass of rosé, that if we ever had money, she wanted a house in this light. I said we would have a house in this light. She said, "You always say that." I said, "I always mean it." We bought the villa 15 years later. Catherine spent the first 2 summers doing what she had always wanted to do in a property in the south of France. Very little. She read, she cooked. She sat by the pool in the morning and walked through the lavender in the evening and had long dinners on the terrace with friends we had accumulated over 30 years and who came in pairs and small groups through July and August, filling the guest cottage and the spare rooms and talking until the candles burned down. Catherine died in 2017 of a cardiac event that announced itself with no warning on a Tuesday morning in April in the kitchen of our house in Richmond while she was making tea. She was 54 years old. She had been healthy, or appeared to have been, or we had not looked carefully enough at the signs that perhaps were there. The doctors said it was the kind of thing that can happen in certain people regardless of what else is true about them, which is the kind of statement that is medically accurate and humanly useless. After Catherine died, I did not go to the villa for 2 years. I could not. The villa was her idea, her project, her specific joy, and going there without her in the first years would have been a form of presence that I was not ready for. Etienne maintained it. I paid the running costs. I told myself I would go back when I was ready and spent 2 years not being ready, and then went back in the summer of 2019 and sat by the pool for 3 days without doing much of anything and found that it was all right. Not good exactly, but all right. The kind of all right that is the beginning of something. I have been going back every summer since, usually in June before it gets too hot, usually alone or with Graham, or occasionally with my daughter Sophie, who is 28 and who loved the villa as a child and who visits when her own life permits. I go back and I sit in Catherine's chair on the left side of the terrace, and I drink coffee and I look at the valley and I think about what she would have made of the current shape of things. I think she would have had opinions. She always had opinions. My son Daniel is 33 years old. He works in financial services in London, a role that involves the movement of money in ways that I understand in principle and do not require detail on in practice. He is good at it. He is precise and careful and has his mother's ability to read a room without appearing to, which is one of the more useful capabilities a person can have in most professional environments. He met Vanessa in 2019. She works in luxury brand management, which means, as far as I can tell, that she advises companies on how to make expensive things feel appropriately expensive to people who are paying a great deal to have them. She is good at it. She has a specific authority in rooms where appearance is the currency, and she manages the particular performance of elevated taste with the fluency of someone who has been practicing it for long enough that she no longer has to think about it. She is also, and I want to be precise about this because the story requires precision, a person who has a tendency to arrange facts into the most favorable configuration available, which is a quality that is professionally useful and personally complicated. They married in 2021. I gave a speech at the wedding that was what wedding speeches from fathers of grooms should be: warm, specific, moderately funny, and appropriately brief. Vanessa's family was there in force. a large and confident group from Surrey who had strong opinions about the wine and expressed them to the sommelier directly, which I respected even when I disagreed with the conclusions. In the first year of their marriage, I had dinner with Daniel and Vanessa approximately once a month. These were pleasant evenings. The conversation was good, the food was good. Vanessa was attentive and curious, in the way of a person who is building a relationship and is applying professional skill to the project, which is not the same as sincerity, but can coexist with it. I enjoyed them. In the second year, the dinners became less frequent. Daniel was busy. Vanessa's career had accelerated into a period that required more of her time and travel than the previous year. I understood this. I had been that busy myself for most of my working life, and I knew what it looked like from the outside and from the inside, and I did not take the reduced frequency personally. What I did begin to take note of, in the way I take note of things that register as anomalous before I have a clear understanding of why, was a pattern in the way Vanessa discussed certain things. It started with small things. At a dinner in the spring of the second year, Vanessa was talking about the villa to a friend of hers who had joined us. She described it as their property in Provence, not my father-in-law's property, not the family villa, their property. I noticed it. I said nothing. At a lunch with her mother, which I attended because Daniel asked me to and which was a pleasant enough occasion, Vanessa mentioned that they had a place in Provence and that they were planning to use it in the summer. Her mother asked about it, and Vanessa described the property with the detailed authority of someone who has ownership in a thing, which she did not. I said nothing. At a professional event, a drinks reception that Daniel and Vanessa attended and that I was at for a separate reason and which we had not known we would both be at until I arrived. I heard Vanessa describe herself to two colleagues as, and I am giving you the words as they were given to me afterward by a man who had been in the conversation and who knows me well enough to understand that I would want to know, the co-owner of a villa in the Luberon. Her colleagues asked about it. She discussed the pool, the layout, the view. She mentioned that the property had been in the family for 15 years. This is not true in the way she was presenting it. The property had been in my family for 15 years. It was mine. It is mine. Vanessa had visited 3 times. She had access to it as the wife of my son, in the same way that she had access to a great many things that I had built and paid for and which were made available to the people I love because I love them and because things are only as useful as the life that happens in and around them. The villa was Catherine's dream. I built it for her, and she loved it, and she died before she could love it as long as she deserved to. Vanessa, calling herself the co-owner of a place that Catherine had designed the tile selection and the lavender planting and the dinner table configuration for, was the specific thing that moved me from noticing to considering what to do about it. I called Graham. Graham Fletcher has been my business partner for 31 years. He is 62 and has been married to the same woman for 34 years and has 4 children and 7 grandchildren and the specific patience of a man who has seen most things and is not easily surprised by any of them. I told him what I was telling you. He listened. He said, "Peter, what is it that you want to happen?" I said, "I want her to understand the difference between a thing that is yours and a thing that has been made available to you." He said, "Those are different problems with different solutions." I said, "I know." He said, "One of them requires a conversation, and one of them requires a situation." I said, "Yes." He said, "Which one are you planning?" I thought about Catherine in the cafe and Apt with a rosé, saying, "If we ever have money, I want a house in this light." I said, "The second one." Graham said, "I thought so." He said, "What do you need from me?" I said nothing. I just needed to say it to someone who would ask the right question. He said, "I usually do." The situation presented itself in March. Daniel called on a Sunday evening to tell me that Vanessa had been planning a holiday for her group of friends, 5 women she had known since university, and that they had been looking at venues and the villa had come up, and Vanessa had wondered whether it might be available in the second week of June. He said it in the careful way he says things when he knows I might have a view that requires management. He said Vanessa thought it would be a great opportunity to show them the property. She's talked about it quite a bit with her friends. I said, I imagine she has. He said, "Is that okay, Dad?" I said, "Of course." "Tell her yes." He said she's thinking of it as a sort of hosting opportunity, showing it off a bit. I said, "The villa is available the second week of June. Tell her to arrange it with Etienne." He said, "You're not going to be there." I said, "I was thinking of going in June, actually." He said, "The same week." I said, "I was thinking of going a little earlier, the Tuesday before." A pause. He said, "Dad." I said, "I like to open the house up before guests arrive. Make sure everything is in order." He said, "It'll be in order. Etienne handles all of that." I said, "I know he does, but I like to be there when the lavender is coming in. You know how I am about the lavender." He said, "Dad." I said, "Tell Vanessa to make her arrangements. I'll be there when she arrives. I'll make myself scarce if the group wants privacy." A longer pause. He said, "You're not going to make yourself scarce." I said, "I'm going to sit by my pool and drink my coffee and be as scarce or as present as the situation requires." He said, "Dad." I said, "Daniel." He said, "What is actually happening here?" I said, "I am going to my villa in June. Your wife and her friends are welcome to join me." He said, "You know what I mean?" I said, "I do. And I want you to hear me say clearly that I am not doing anything that is unkind or unfair to your wife. I am going to my own property at a time when she has also planned to be there. That is the full extent of it." He was quiet. He said, "She calls it her villa, Dad." I said, "I know she does." He said, "To her friends, to her mother. I've heard her." I said, "I know." He said, "And you've never said anything." I said, "I have not said anything yet." Another pause. He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm coming too." I said, "I expected you would." He said, "I'm not coming to manage you." I said, "I know. You're coming because you want to be there." He said, "Yes." I said, "Good. Tell Etienne to make up the master suite for you. Tell him I'll be in the east bedroom." He said, "You always stay in the east bedroom." I said, "It has the better morning light." He said, "Mum always said the master got the afternoon." I said, "She was right about that, too." He said, "She was right about most things." I said, "Yes, she was." I flew to Marseille on the Tuesday. Etienne met me at the airport in the property car, which is a 10-year-old Peugeot that has transported more bottles of local wine than I have kept count of. And we drove the 90 minutes to the valley in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have been doing the same journey in the same car for long enough that the silence is the conversation. Etienne briefed me on the property as we drove. The pool system had been serviced in April. The lavender was coming in well, better than last year, the rainfall in May having been close to ideal. The cypresses were healthy. There had been some work on the guest cottage roof that he had managed while I was not there, and which had come in under the estimate. I said, "Etienne, my daughter-in-law's coming Friday with 5 friends." He said, "Yes." She contacted me in April to arrange the week. She had some questions about the sleeping arrangements and the kitchen facilities. I said, "What kind of questions?" He said carefully, "She asked about the staff schedule, about what level of service would be included. She mentioned that she was hosting a group and wanted to make sure the property was presented at its best." I said, What else? He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is deciding how much is appropriate. He said, "She asked whether the owner would be in residence. I told her the property would be available for the week of the 8th. She asked if that meant the owner would not be there. I told her the owner's schedule was the owner's business and that I would be in contact with you. I said, 'Did she ask you to confirm I wouldn't be there?' He said, 'She asked if the week was a dedicated guest week or a family week.' I said, 'What did you tell her?' He said, 'I told her it was the owner's property and the owner's schedule was always flexible.' I said, 'Good.' He said after a moment, 'Monsieur Holt, is there anything I should be aware of for this week?' I said, 'You should be aware that I am arriving Tuesday, and I will be at the property when my daughter-in-law arrives on Friday. She will be with 5 of her friends. I would like you to greet her the way you would greet any guest, and I would like you to greet me the way you greet me, which is the way you greet the person whose name is on the deed.' He said, 'Of course.' I said, 'And I would like the east bedroom made up and fresh flowers on the pool terrace each morning.' He said, 'I'll have Celine see to the flowers.' I said, 'Catherine always liked the lavender cut long.' He said, 'I know. I'll tell Celine.' Tuesday and Wednesday. I did what I always do in the first days at the villa, which is very little with great deliberateness. I walked the property in the morning. The lavender was, as Etienne had said, better than last year, fuller and more fragrant, the kind of lavender that makes you understand why people have been planting it in this valley for centuries. The olive trees were silvery and calm. The cypresses threw their shadows across the south wall in the way I had imagined when I planted them in 2009. Everything was as it should be. I sat by the pool in the morning with coffee, and in the afternoon with a glass of the local rosé from the producer 3 kilometers up the road, who had been making wine on that land for 40 years and who had sold me 6 cases when I first bought the property, because he said any serious person who bought property in this valley ought to understand what the valley tasted like. He was right, and I have bought from him every year since. Wednesday evening, Etienne and his wife Marie, who prepares the meals when I am in residence, cooked a simple dinner on the terrace. Roast chicken from the farm in the village, tomatoes from the kitchen garden, bread from the boulangerie in Bonnieux, a bottle of the rosé, the valley going from gold to purple as the light changed, and the cicadas starting up in the lavender. I sat at the table where Catherine had sat for 8 summers, and I thought about her the way I think about her in this place, which is fully, without the management that grief sometimes requires in other settings. Here she is simply present. The table is her table. The lavender was planted where she pointed. The tile selection is her taste. The cypress trees were her idea. She thought they would look like the trees in the painting she loved. She was right. They look exactly like that. I was ready for Friday. Thursday, Daniel arrived. He flew into Marseille on the early flight and took a cab, which he prefers because it gives him time to read and because he is his mother's son in the way of a person who takes transitions seriously. He came through the gate in the late morning with a single bag and the particular expression of a person who has been thinking about something for the duration of a journey and has not finished thinking. He put his bag down. He looked at me, sitting at the pool. He said, "You look rested." I said, "It's been a good week." He said, "It's been 3 days." I said, 3 good days. He sat in the chair beside me, Catherine's chair, which he has always used without thinking about it, which is the right way to use a dead person's chair. He said, "Vanessa's flight lands at 2 tomorrow. They're renting a minivan from the airport." I said, "I know. Etienne has the details." He said, 6 of them, Vanessa and 5 friends. I said, "Yes." He said, "Her friends are—they're her people, Dad." They're the women she's been closest to since she was 20. They mean a lot to her. I said, I understand that. He said, she's been looking forward to showing them this place. I said, the place is worth showing. He said, she's described it to them as... I said, I know how she has described it. He said, I should have said something. I should have told her a long time ago that it was not how it works. And I didn't, and now we're here. I said, why didn't you? He thought about it. He said, because she was proud of it, of the connection to it. She loves this place genuinely, Dad. Whatever else is true, she loves it, and I didn't want to make her feel small for loving something. I said, that is a generous reading of it. He said, it's the true one. I said, I know. He said, is this going to be hard for her tomorrow? I said, that depends on who she has decided she is. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means that what happens tomorrow is a piece of information arriving. What she does with the information is hers. I am not here to make it hard for her. I am here because this is my property, and I enjoy being at my property in June. He said, and Etienne greeting you by name in front of everyone. I said, Etienne greets me by name because my name is on the deed, and we have known each other for 9 years. That is not theater. That is what it looks like when a thing is what it is. Daniel was quiet. He said, she'll be embarrassed. I said, yes, she will. He said, in front of her friends. I said, yes. He said, and you are okay with that. I said, I am okay with a person who has been misrepresenting a thing being in the presence of the thing. What she feels about that is her own accounting. He said, Dad. I said, Daniel. He said, I love her. I said, I know. And nothing that happens tomorrow changes that or needs to. This is not about your marriage. This is about a specific correction that is 3 years overdue. It will happen, and it will be uncomfortable, and it will be over, and then we will all have dinner on the terrace, and the valley will do what it does at sunset, and the discomfort will be in its correct proportion. He said, you sound very calm about it. I said, I have had 3 days of lavender and Marie's cooking. He almost smiled. He said, Mum would have done this differently. I said, your mother would have had a conversation in year 1 and sorted it out over a glass of wine. He said, that's what I mean. I said, I am not your mother. I am her husband's approximation. I work with what I have. He said, that's not nothing. I said, no, it isn't. We sat by the pool until the light changed. Etienne brought out the rosé without being asked, which is one of the reasons I have been relying on his judgment for 9 years. Friday, I was at the pool by 8. Coffee. The eastern light doing what it does in June in the Luberon, which is making every surface it touches look like it was designed specifically for the purpose of receiving it. The lavender was fragrant after the cool of the night. The cypress shadows were exact. The pool tiles were Gerard's particular blue. I had my book. I had my coffee. I had everything I needed. Etienne came to the terrace at 10 to tell me the rental vehicle had been tracked on the road from Apt and would arrive in approximately 40 minutes. He had the gate code in Vanessa's hands. He would meet them at the gate. I said, thank you, Etienne. He said, of course, Monsieur Holt. He said it the way he always says it, which is without ceremony and with complete precision. Daniel came down at 10:15. He poured himself coffee and sat in the chair beside me. He said, they're close. I said, yes. He said, how do you feel? I said, I feel the way I feel sitting by my pool on a June morning in Provence with good coffee and the lavender coming in. How do you think I feel? He said, you're impossible. I said, I have been told. He said, Mum said it regularly. I said, she was better at it than anyone else. We sat in the quiet. The cicadas were already running. The valley was clear and still, and the blue of the pool was holding the morning light. At 10:48, I heard the vehicle on the drive. I did not move. I heard the gate open. I heard the doors. I heard 6 voices doing what 6 women do when they arrive somewhere they have been anticipating, which is react to everything at once in overlapping enthusiasms. I heard footsteps on the gravel. I heard Etienne's voice, formal and warm in the specific Provençal hospitality register he has perfected over decades. He said, "Madame Laurent, bienvenue." And then, after a half-second, that was exactly the right length. Monsieur Holt is already in residence. He arrived on Tuesday. I heard the voices stop. I did not look at the gate. I looked at the pool. I drank my coffee. I let the information travel the 30 meters from the gate to wherever Vanessa was standing, and I let it arrive at its own pace, which it did. Then I heard her footsteps on the terrace. I turned. She was standing at the edge of the terrace, 5 feet from the pool, with the morning sun behind her. She was wearing sunglasses, so I could not see her eyes, but I could see her face, and her face had the very specific expression of a person who has just arrived at a location and discovered that the map they have been using does not correspond to the territory. Behind her, at a respectful and attentive distance, were 5 women, her friends, the women she had known since she was 20, and who she had brought here to show them a thing she had described as hers. They were looking at me. I looked at them. I said, "Good morning. Welcome to the Holt property. I'm Peter. You must be Vanessa's friends. Etienne will show you to your rooms, and I'll stay out of your way until you're settled. The lavender is particularly good this year. It's worth walking the south path before the afternoon heat comes in." Vanessa said nothing. One of her friends, a woman with red hair and the particular expression of someone who's very quickly doing arithmetic, said, "Thank you. It's absolutely beautiful." I said, "Thank you. We think so. I'll be at the pool if anyone needs anything." I picked up my coffee. I opened my book. For the first 4 hours, she did not speak to me. This was not, I want to say clearly, because I had engineered a situation that trapped her. She was free to do what she liked. She could have come and spoken to me at any point. She could have introduced me to her friends, acknowledged the situation, made any number of choices that would have moved things forward. She chose not to. That was hers. What she did instead was conduct the group around the property with the competence of a person who actually does know the layout and the best features and where the light is best at which time of day, because she had been here 3 times and she was observant and she had paid attention. I watched this from a respectful distance, and I thought, she is not without capability. She is a person who picked up a thing that was not hers and carried it as though it were, and became very good at describing it. That is a specific skill. It is just not the same as ownership. Daniel moved between the group and the terrace with the careful calibration of a man who loves 2 parties and is trying not to be the dividing line between them. He talked to Vanessa's friends. He showed one of them the path through the lavender. He talked to me twice, briefly, about nothing significant. He was managing it. I appreciated that. It was not his problem to manage, and he was managing it anyway because that is who he is. At 2 in the afternoon, Etienne served lunch on the terrace. Cold meats, cheese from the market in Apt, salad from the kitchen garden, bread, the rosé. The 7 of us sat at Catherine's table in the southern sun, and I watched the women relax into the ease of a very good lunch in a very beautiful place. And I thought about the first time Catherine and I had eaten at that table in the summer of 2009, the year we bought it, when neither of us fully believed yet that the place was real and ours. Vanessa sat at the opposite end of the table. Her friends had, by this point, done the social recalibration that intelligent people do when a situation has shifted, and they are trying to establish the new coordinates. The red-haired woman, whose name was Claire, had positioned herself next to me by the time lunch was served, and was asking me about the property in the direct way of someone who has decided that the most interesting information at the table is sitting at one end of it. She asked about the tile selection, and when I explained about Gerard and the 3 days in Marseille, she laughed and said that was exactly the kind of decision that either ends in disaster or becomes the best thing about a house. I said that was also my experience of most things worth doing. Vanessa was listening to this from the other end of the table. I know she was listening because people who are pretending not to listen have a specific quality of stillness that is different from genuine inattention, and she was very still. At 3:15, when the lunch things had been cleared and the group had dispersed to the pool and the guest cottage and the shaded chairs along the lavender path, Vanessa came to the terrace. She sat in the chair beside me. Danielle's chair. Catherine's chair. She was not wearing her sunglasses now. She said, "Peter." I said, "Vanessa." She said, "I owe you an explanation." I said, "You don't owe me an explanation. You owe me an accurate description of a thing." She said, "I've told people this was our property. The family property, co-owned." I said, "Yes." She said, "That wasn't true." I said, "No." She'd said, "I don't know exactly when I started saying it. At first I think I meant it as shorthand. We were family, we had access, it felt like—" She stopped. She said, "It felt like something I could include myself in without taking anything from anyone." I said, "I understand why it felt that way." She said, "But," I said, "but a thing that is made available to you is not the same thing as a thing that is yours. Your access to this place is real, and it is given gladly. It has been given since the first time you and Daniel came here. It will continue to be given. That is not the same as co-ownership." She said, "No, it isn't." I said, "Catherine bought the lavender for the South Path from a grower in Coucoron who is now retired. She spent 4 mornings selecting it. The specific variety, the spacing, the relationship between it and the cypress line. That was her design. She is the co-owner of this property. She has been since 2009. She will be until the deed changes hands, which is not something I am currently planning." Vanessa was very still. She said, "I didn't know about the lavender." I said, "There are things about this property that I have not told you because the occasion has not arisen. That is partly my responsibility. I should have told you more. I should have talked to you more about Catherine and about what this place meant to her and what it means to me. If I had done that, perhaps the shorthand would not have developed as it did." She said, "That's generous." I said, "It is accurate. I am not absolved of the part of this that is mine, but neither are you." She said, "No." I said, "Your friends are good people. Claire is very sharp." She said, "She's a property lawyer." I said, "That explains some things." Vanessa almost smiled. She said, "She asked me quietly on the walk around this morning whether the co-ownership was formal or informal. I said I would explain later. I said, 'What will you tell her?' She said, 'The truth, that this is your property. You have been generous in making it available to the family, and I used a shorthand that I should not have used.' I said, 'That is accurate, and it is sufficient.' She said, 'It's embarrassing.' I said, 'Yes, it is, and it will pass.' She said, 'Your friends and colleagues, the ones who have been here, they know.' I said, 'They know it's my property. They also know that the people I love have access to it, which is a normal thing for a person with a property to arrange. Nobody has been counting.' She said, 'Except you.' I said, 'I have been paying attention. That is not the same as counting.' She said, 'What's the difference?' I said, 'Counting produces a score. Paying attention produces information.' She looked at the pool, at Gerard's tiles, at the cypress shadows on the south wall. She said, 'It's the most beautiful place I've ever been.' I said, 'I know. That's why Catherine wanted it.' She said, 'Tell me about her. You've never really talked about her to me.' I said, 'No, I haven't. That's been my failure. She said, would you now? I looked at the valley, at the lavender, at the light, doing what it does in June in the Luberon, which is making everything look like it has been here forever and was put here specifically for the purpose of being looked at. I said, she was practical and funny, and she told the truth without drama, which is rarer than people think and more valuable than they know until they have gone a while without it. She grew up in Edinburgh. She hated being cold, which is a difficult quality to have when you grow up in Edinburgh. She found the south of France and decided it was where cold people went to be corrected. She picked every tile and every lavender plant and the spacing of the cypress trees, and she was right about all of it. She died in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning making tea, and she was 54 years old, and this valley still has her in it everywhere I look. Vanessa was quiet for a while. She said, Daniel has her eyes. I said, he does. He also has her way of entering a room, that instinct for the temperature of things. She said, I know. It's one of the things I love most about him. We sat for a moment, in the comfortable quiet of two people who have arrived somewhere they needed to get to and have stopped moving. She said, I'm sorry, Peter, for the co-owner thing, for describing it the way I have. It was wrong, and I knew somewhere that it was wrong, and I did it anyway because it made me feel like I belonged to something. I think that was what it was about, if I'm honest. I said, belonging to something is a reasonable thing to want. She said, I have a family now. Daniel's family. Your family. I don't need to manufacture a claim. The real one is better. I said, yes, it is. She said, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, did you come early specifically for this? To be here when we arrived? I looked at her. She was looking at me with the directness of someone who has decided to stop managing the impression and simply ask. I said, I came early because I like to open the house before guests arrive, and because the lavender is particularly good this year, and because this is my property, and I come to it when I like. She said, and, I said, and I thought it would be useful for certain things to be clear. She said, so yes. I said, so yes. She said, okay, that's fair. I said, I thought so. She almost laughed, a real one, the kind that has something genuine behind it. She said, Catherine would have done it differently. I said, Catherine would have called you in year one and sorted it out over a glass of wine. She said, I would have preferred that. I said, so would I in retrospect. She said, why didn't you? I said, because I was waiting to be ready for a conversation that had Catherine in it. And then by the time I was ready, the situation had developed its own shape, and the direct conversation had become harder, and I chose the other kind instead. She said, the lavender and pool kind. I said, that is not the official name for it. She said, it should be. Dinner that evening was on the terrace, all 7 of us. Etienne and Marie had prepared the full thing, a proper Provençal dinner, with the local lamb and the tomatoes and the tapenade and the bread and 3 bottles of the wine from the producer up the road. Candles, in the way Catherine had always arranged them, which Etienne's wife knew from years of observation, the valley doing what it does at sunset. Claire sat next to me again. She had a great many questions about the development industry and about property in the south of France specifically, and we talked for an hour with the ease of 2 people who find a subject genuinely interesting and have plenty to say about it. Her husband, she said, was an architect. I said that architects and property developers had a relationship of productive mutual irritation that had produced most of the best buildings of the last 50 years. She said, that's the most tactful way I have ever heard that described. Vanessa, across the table, was herself, relaxed and capable in the way she is when she is not performing. Funny, in the specific dry way that I had glimpsed once or twice in 3 years, and which I understood now to be the real version underneath the management. She told a story about a brand campaign that had gone wrong in a specific and escalating way that had the table laughing for 5 minutes solid. I laughed at the right moments because they were the right moments and because I was genuinely enjoying myself. Daniel watched all of this with the expression of a man who has been tensed for an impact that did not come in the form he anticipated and is slowly releasing the tension and finding that the evening is better than he feared. After dinner, when the group had dispersed to the terrace chairs and the conversation had settled into the comfortable mode of people who are full and slightly wine-warm and looking at a valley going dark in the southern French way, Daniel came and sat beside me. He said, "How was your afternoon?" I said, "Good." He said, "You and Vanessa talked." I said, "We did." He said, "She told me a bit. She seemed different afterward." I said, "She said the true thing." "That changes the temperature." He said, "She said you told her about Mum." I said, "Yes." He said, "She's been wanting to know about her for 3 years. She told me. She said she didn't know how to ask." I said, "I didn't know how to tell." He said, "And now?" I said, "And now I have started. I expect there will be more occasions." He said, "I'd like that." I said, "So would I." He said, "She belongs here, Dad, not on the deed." "But here," I said, "I know she does. I knew it before today. I needed her to know it in the right way." He said, "The lavender and pool way." I said, "She told you that." He said, "She texted Claire about it from the dinner table. Claire apparently found it very efficient." I said, "She's a property lawyer. She understands efficiency." He said, "Mum would have liked her." I said, "Mum would have liked this whole evening." He said, "She would have had notes on the seating arrangement." I said, "She always had notes on the seating arrangement." He said, "She would have been right." I said, "She always was." Here's what I want to say clearly, because a story has to mean something or it is just a sequence of events, and this one means something specific. I built things for 31 years. Properties, primarily, but also relationships and systems and the kind of trust between people who work together that is the actual foundation of anything durable. I built them with Catherine beside me for most of it, and when she was gone, I continued building in the way you continue doing a thing when the person you did it with is no longer there, which is imperfectly but with the full weight of what you learned from them. The villa is not a monument to wealth. Plenty of people in the south of France have larger and more expensive properties, and I have been in most of them, and they are perfectly nice. The villa is a monument to Catherine's specific desire for a house in a particular light, fulfilled after 15 years of working toward it. It is the physical version of a promise I made in a cafe in Apt, in Tisica Devitsat Devanostachitira, to a woman who said I always say things, and I said I always mean them. I will not have anyone describe that as something it is not. Not out of pride, out of accuracy, out of the specific fidelity I owe to the woman who pointed at the place where the lavender should go. Vanessa is not a bad person. She is a person who wanted to belong to something and borrowed a claim to it because the borrowing was available and nobody stopped it. That is a human thing to do. I understand it. I was also not prepared to let it continue, and I handled my not preparing to let it continue in the way that was available to me given the particular emotional geography of the situation, which was to be at my pool when she arrived, and to let the fact of my being at my pool communicate what 3 years of not saying had not. She received the communication. She did something with it. She said the true thing in the afternoon, and she sat at the table in the evening and was herself, genuinely, without the performance. That is the ending I wanted, and it is the ending we got. Claire emailed me 3 weeks after the Villa Week. She said she had a client with a property in the VAR who was looking for development advice for a conversion project, and she had taken the liberty of passing my name on. She said she hoped that was appropriate. I said it was. She said, for what it's worth, Vanessa talked about that villa for years before I ever went. She always said it was the most beautiful place she had ever been. I think she meant it, and I think she just got confused somewhere about the difference between loving a thing and owning it. I said, yes, that is a reasonable summary. She said, your wife picked very well. I said she always did. The lavender is being harvested now. Etienne sent photographs last week. The color this year, with the rainfall it had in May, is the best it has been since Dve Tisici Turnitsit. Catherine would have had opinions about the harvest timing. She would have been right about those, too. I know what I built. I know for whom I built it. I know who it belongs to. And I know that the best way to make those things clear sometimes is simply to be sitting by your pool when the car comes through the gate. See you in the next one.